Most people have never heard the name Scott LaRock, and that is the first tragedy of the genre. Because without him, hip-hop wouldn't just sound different, it might not have survived its own infancy. We are investigating the life and death of Scott Sterling, a man who walked into the birthplace of hip-hop, the Bronx, not with a weapon, but with a business administration degree and a calm that terrified the chaotic. He was the gentleman DJ, a 6'3" bridge between the corporate boardrooms he was built for and the blood-stained sidewalks that eventually claimed him. The investigation into the 1,980 Bronx reveals a landscape of jagged survival. The buildings were literal skeletons, the heat pipes screamed in the winter, and the sirens were the only constant melody. Scott's father vanished when he was 4, leaving his mother to work double shifts to keep the lights on. But Scott didn't grow up angry. He grew up observant. He saw the gangs, the fires, and the addiction, but he also saw a lamppost on Sedgwick Avenue being hijacked to power a turntable. He saw DJ Kool Herc turn a war zone into a dance floor, and in that moment, the forensic seeds of his mission were planted. He realized that music wasn't just sound, it was structure. It was the only thing that could hold the Bronx together. While his peers were dropping out, Scott was leaning in. He captained his high school basketball team and rode a full scholarship all the way to Vermont. He was a black face in a sea of white snow at Castleton State, but he didn't assimilate, he exported. He turned the college radio station into a Bronx outpost, teaching the children of privilege about graffiti, breakdancing, and the philosophy of the breakbeat. When he graduated, he held a degree that could have taken him to Wall Street. He had the suits. He had the lexicon of the elite. But Scott LaRock turned down the overseas basketball contracts and the office desks. He packed his records and headed straight back into the fire of New York. The investigation into his return shows a man who chose purpose over profit. He took a job as a social worker at the Franklin Men's Shelter, a grim industrial warehouse for the discarded. It was a place where ex-cons and addicts waited to disappear. This is where the trajectory of hip-hop changed forever. Scott, wearing a tie and carrying a briefcase, met a homeless, volatile teenager named Chris Parker. Chris was a poet who lived in the shelter and rapped for his dinner. They argued over meal tickets before they ever shared a microphone. Scott saw the blast master in the boy. Chris saw the soul in the social worker. Together, they became Boogie Down Productions, BDP. Their partnership was a chemical reaction. Scott provided the business structure and the minimalist, heavy production. KRS-One provided the fire and the message. Their 1,987 debut, Criminal Minded, was a forensic masterpiece. The cover featured them surrounded by grenades and firearms, but they weren't glorifying the violence, they were documenting the war they lived in. Scott was building an empire out of rhythm, negotiating with major labels like Warner Brothers for full publishing rights, a move that was decades ahead of its time. He was becoming too smart for the system he was trying to disrupt. He was becoming a threat to the people who profited from the chaos. And then came the night of the 27th of August, 1987. A petty dispute involving a girl and a young protege named D-Nice. Scott, the peacemaker, the gentleman, decided he could solve the beef with words. He drove his Jeep into the Highbridge projects, believing that his intellect was a shield. He didn't know that on the rooftops above, the rules of the Bronx had already been rewritten. 2 shots broke the night. One missed. The other found the man who was trying to save the music. As he slumped in his seat, Scott reportedly asked a question that has haunted the genre for nearly 40 years. Why is the music so loud? At 25 years old, the architect was gone. The case was never solved, but the whispers in the Bronx tell a story of an assassination, a warning to any young black man who dared to be smarter than the street. The lights went out on Scott LaRock, and for the first time, hip-hop had to learn how to mourn. The death of Scott LaRock wasn't just a homicide, it was a structural collapse. When the news hit the radio waves on the morning of the 27th of August, 1987, the Bronx didn't just mourn, it froze. The investigation into the immediate aftermath reveals a culture that was completely unequipped for grief. Up until that point, hip-hop was about the yes, yes y'all, the party, and the boast. There was no protocol for burying a titan. There were no tribute tracks. There was only a jagged, terrifying hole where the architect used to be. The forensic psychological toll on the surviving members of Boogie Down Productions was catastrophic. KRS-One, the man who had been plucked from a homeless shelter by Scott's belief, was now a captain without a navigator. The investigation shows a man spiraling into a specific kind of survivor's guilt. He had stayed behind that night. He had been the one Scott was protecting. For weeks, KRS-One reportedly couldn't enter a recording studio. The smell of the equipment, the hum of the monitors, it all carried the scent of a dead man's dream. But in the world of the streets, silence is a vacuum that gets filled by violence. The investigation reveals that the Bronx was teetering on the edge of a retaliatory war. The men arrested for the shooting, Corey Bain and Kendall Newland, eventually walked free because no witnesses were willing to testify. In the code of the projects, you don't talk to the police. You handle it yourself. But Scott's mother and his closest friends did something radical. They called for a halt. They realized that if the first DJ died to save a crew, the crew couldn't die to avenge a DJ. This realization birthed the Stop the Violence movement. It was the first time hip-hop acted as its own governing body. KRS-One transformed his grief into a curriculum. He moved from being the blast master to the teacher, realizing that if the culture didn't police itself, the system would use Scott's death as an excuse to shut the whole movement down. The investigation into the 1989 anthem Self-Destruction shows the sheer scale of Scott's influence. Every major voice of the era Public Enemy, Heavy D, MC Lyte, Kool Moe Dee, showed up for a man many of them had never met. They weren't just recording a song, they were performing a forensic autopsy on the streets. They were asking the question, why are we killing the very people who are trying to tell our story? The song raised over $100,000 for the National Urban League, proving that Scott's business-minded vision of hip-hop as a social force was correct, even if he wasn't there to see the check. However, the cracked mirror reveals a darker forensic reality. While the movement was a success, the personal fallout was permanent. D-Nice, the young protege Scott died trying to protect, would spend the next 30 years carrying a shadow he couldn't outrun. The investigation shows a deep fracture between the survivors. When the business of BDP continued, it felt to some like a betrayal. How do you market a group that is built on a ghost? As we look at the legacy of the Stop the Violence movement, we realize it was hip-hop's first attempt at a soul. Scott LaRock had to die for the genre to realize it was mortal. He was the sacrifice that bought the golden age its conscience. But as we move into Part 3, we will investigate the unsolved ledger, the persistent rumors that Scott's death wasn't a street accident, but a corporate hit ordered by an industry that was terrified of a black man with a briefcase and a plan. In the official NYPD report, Scott LaRock died because of a spontaneous street dispute involving a young woman and a bruised ego. Case closed. But in the world of music forensics, the official report is often just the redacted cover page for a much darker, much more profitable story. When we dig into the financial timeline of Boogie Down Productions leading up to that fatal night in August 1987, a different motive begins to emerge from the ledgers. Scott LaRock wasn't just a DJ sitting behind turntables. He was the primary negotiator, the legal shield, and the strategic brain for the most revolutionary group in New York. And he was about to make a move that would have decapitated the power structure of the independent label system. The investigation into B-Boy Records, the small, street-level label that released the seminal album Criminal Minded, reveals a landscape of classic 1,980 seconds exploitation. B-Boy was a rough-around-the-edges operation that suddenly found itself sitting on a cultural gold mine. The album was selling at a rate the label's primitive infrastructure couldn't track, or more likely, refused to track. Scott Sterling, with his business administration degree and his Wall Street intellect, began performing an unauthorized audit of the numbers. He realized, with clinical precision, that the group was being systematically robbed of their mechanical royalties and touring income. He didn't just complain to the neighborhood, he acted like the executive he was trained to be. The forensic trail shows that at the time of his death, Scott was in high-level, secret negotiations with Warner Brothers. Records. He wasn't just looking for a new home for the group, He was demanding a contract that was almost unheard of for a rap act in 1987, full ownership of the master recordings and music publishing. Scott was attempting to perform a corporate rescue mission, taking the criminal-minded catalog away from the street-level owners of B-Boy Records and moving it to a major label where he could control the flow of capital. In the predatory, often organized crime-linked ecosystem of the 1980 seconds music business, this didn't just make Scott a difficult artist, it made him a terminal financial liability to the men who owned the independent infrastructure. Whispers from those inside the Bronx scene, voices that have remained off the record for decades, suggest that the jealous boyfriend who started the altercation with D-Nice may have been a convenient, prearranged catalyst. The investigation into the shooting mechanics is chilling. 2 shots fired from a tactical, elevated position into a specific vehicle. This suggests a level of premeditation and marksmanship that simply does not align with a spontaneous street beef. The theory in the streets was simple. If you want to kill a movement, you don't kill the poet, you kill the architect. You kill the man who knows how to read the contracts. You kill the auditor. The immediate fallout of his death confirms the corporate ghost theory. Once Scott was in the ground, the legal battle for the BDP catalog turned into a decade-long nightmare of injunctions, disappearing paperwork, and frozen assets. KRS-One eventually signed with Jive Records, but the criminal-minded masters remained entangled in a web of litigation that benefited no one but the original label owners. The investigation reveals that the independent labels of the era often functioned with the logic of a syndicate. They would rather see a genius dead than see him independent. Scott LaRock was the first man in hip-hop who truly understood that the paperwork was more powerful than the pipe, and that realization made him the most dangerous man in the Bronx. As we analyze the final ledger, the irony is heartbreaking. By removing the man who wanted to professionalize the genre, the industry inadvertently immortalized the outlaw image. The investigation shows that criminal-minded saw a massive, global spike in sales following the murder money that flowed directly back into the pockets of the very system Scott was trying to dismantle. He became a ghost in the machine, a legend whose image was used to market the very street violence he had spent his life trying to educate his community against. In the forensic study of trauma, there is a devastating concept known as the identification of the catalyst. It is the moment a survivor realizes they were the spark that started the fire. For 25 years, that catalyst had a name and a face: Derek D-Nice Jones. In 1987, D-Nice was the youngest, most vulnerable member of the BDP circle, a 16-year-old kid who looked up to Scott LaRock not just as a DJ, but as a guardian, a mentor, and a god. The investigation into the night of August 27 reveals a truth that would eventually poison the group's brotherhood. Scott LaRock didn't go to the Highbridge projects for business, for money, or for fame. He went because D-Nice had been assaulted. Scott LaRock died because he chose to be a big brother instead of a businessman. The psychological fallout for D-Nice was a life sentence of silent, agonizing guilt. While KRS-One ascended to become the teacher, the public face of a global movement, and the philosopher king of the culture, D-Nice became a living ghost. The investigation into the years following the funeral shows a devastating fracture in the BDP Foundation. D-Nice reportedly felt that every time he looked at KRS-One, he was looking into a mirror of his own catastrophic mistake. Conversely, every time KRS-One looked at D-Nice, he saw the physical reason his architect was in the ground. They didn't have a public falling out. They didn't have an argument. They simply drifted into a radioactive silence. For a quarter century, the most important partnership in the history of the Bronx was effectively erased by the weight of a dead man's memory. The dossier on this 25-year silence is a heartbreaking study in emotional isolation. D-Nice eventually found success as a photographer and a world-class DJ, but he lived as a man with a secret he couldn't share. He lived with the recurring, high-definition nightmare of that Jeep Wrangler, the sound of shattered safety glass, and the haunting, confused tone of Scott's final question. The investigation shows that D-Nice spent decades under the crushing belief that the fans, the Bronx, and the culture itself held him personally responsible for the loss of the architect. He carried the survivor's debt like a physical shackle, a burden that stunted the very legacy Scott had sacrificed his life to protect. Then came 2012, a hotel room in Los Angeles. This was the moment of the final reconciliation, the most critical turning point in the BDP narrative. After 2.5 decades of unaddressed pain, D-Nice and KRS-One finally sat in a room together. There were no managers, no cameras, no microphones, and no labels. There was only the clinical truth. The investigation reveals that KRS-One didn't blame D-Nice. In fact, he had been waiting 25 years for D-Nice to finally forgive himself. They realized that by staying apart, they were allowing the corporate ghost and the street violence of the 80 seconds to win a delayed victory. They were letting Scott LaRock die a second death through their collective silence. When they finally emerged from that room, the silence of the prodigal was broken. D-Nice began to speak openly, not about the blood on the pavement, but about Scott's immense brilliance. He began to release his private archives, the photos and the stories that restored Scott LaRock to his rightful place as a business genius, not just a murder victim. The investigation shows that this reconciliation triggered a massive, global re-evaluation of Scott's impact. He was no longer just a cautionary tale or a casualty. He was restored as the founder of the modern independent mindset. But as we close this chapter of the dossier, we must confront the final, most uncomfortable forensic reality. Even with the silence between the survivors broken, the generational hole remains. The investigation of the Bronx today shows a city that has renamed a boulevard after the gentleman DJ, but it also shows a family bloodline that is still struggling to reconcile the legend with the loss. As we move into Part 5, we will investigate The Son's Burden, the story of Scott LaRock Jr., a boy who grew up in the shadow of a martyr he never knew, and the bitter, public words that revealed the high cost of being the child of a hip-hop saint. In the myth-making of the Golden Age, we focus entirely on the martyr. We celebrate the fallen architect, the teacher, the legend in the Jeep. But the forensic reality of Scott LaRock's death has a second, silent victim, one who didn't die on the pavement but had to live in the permanent shadow of it. Scott LaRock Jr. was only 9 months old when his father's life was extinguished in a hail of gunfire. He didn't lose a DJ, he lost a father. And as he grew up in the unforgiving streets of the Bronx, he discovered a devastating truth. His father didn't belong to him. He belonged to the culture. The investigation into the life of Scott Jr. reveals the crushing psychological weight of being hip-hop's first orphan. The psychological profile of a child growing up as the heir to a martyr is one of extreme, chronic displacement. While the world was listening to Criminal Minded and chanting the name of the gentleman DJ in arenas, Scott Jr. was growing up in the very same projects that had claimed his father's life, struggling with a void that no platinum record could ever fill. The investigation into his adolescence shows a trajectory marked by the inherited trauma of the Bronx. Without the guidance of the business-minded man who had navigated the snows of Vermont and the boardrooms of Warner Brothers, Scott Jr. found himself entangled in the very system his father had died trying to reform. He spent his youth cycling through the justice system, a bitter, forensic irony for the son of the man who founded the Stop the Violence movement. The most controversial forensic evidence in this chapter of the dossier comes from the public statements made by Scott Jr. as an adult. He didn't speak with the practiced reverence of a fan. He spoke with the sharp, jagged resentment of a son who felt abandoned by the BDP family. In several raw, unfiltered interviews, he claimed that the men who built their global empires on his father's name, specifically KRS-One, had done nothing for him as he struggled through the realities of poverty and incarceration. The investigation reveals a deep, structural disconnect between the culture and the family. To the music industry, Scott LaRock was a symbol to be honored at award shows and on boulevard signs. To Scott Jr., he was a missing person whose daily absence was a form of ongoing theft. This son's burden exposes what we might call the greatest hypocrisy of the Golden Age. We investigated the corporate ghost, and we analyzed the survivor's guilt. But for decades, the culture failed to investigate the estate of the soul. The investigation shows that for a quarter century, the royalties, the licensing, and the prestige generated by Scott LaRock's foundational genius didn't trickle down to the child he left behind in that 9-month-old's crib. Scott, Jr. grew up watching the city of New York rename a boulevard after his father, while he struggled to find his own name in the same city. It raises a devastating forensic question that the industry still hasn't answered. If hip-hop is truly a community, why was its first child left to fight the streets entirely alone? The investigation shows that the 2012 reconciliation between D-Nice and KRS-One was a victory for the survivors, but it didn't immediately heal the rift with the biological bloodline. It was only much later that tentative efforts were made to bring Scott Jr. into the light, to finally bridge the gap between the martyr and the man. But the forensic damage of those silent decades was already etched into the record. Scott Jr. His life serves as the ultimate proof that when we stop the violence, we must also start the support, or we are simply waiting for the next generation to fall in the same intersection where the previous one was, silenced. As we move into the final chapters of this dossier, we will investigate the resurrection of the mind. We will see how Scott LaRock's 1987 business model finally became the global standard for the 21st century, and we will deliver the final verdict on the man who was too smart for the era that created him. In the world of forensic economics, we look for the first mover, the individual who identifies a massive market disruption before the market itself even has a formal name. In the history of global hip-hop, that first mover was Scott Sterling. The investigation into the modern Mogul era, the multi-billion-dollar world of Jay-Z, Dr. Dre, and the modern artist-entrepreneur shows that they are all building their glass towers on a foundation that Scott LaRock poured in the Bronx in 1986. Scott was the first person to realize that the role of artist was a temporary position, but the role of owner was a permanent seat of power. He wasn't just trying to make a hit record to escape the projects. He was attempting to create a sovereign, black-owned corporate entity that could compete with the legacy systems of Manhattan. He understood, with terrifying clarity, that the real power in hip-hop wasn't found in the microphone, it was hidden in the masters and the publishing. The forensic analysis of Scott's final negotiations with Warner Brothers. In the summer of 1987, reveals a mind that was quite literally decades ahead of its time. While most rappers of that era were blinded by the immediate signing bonus content to receive a leather jacket, a gold chain, and perhaps a leased car, Scott LaRock was demanding a partnership model. He was the first individual to treat hip-hop as a brand rather than a passing subculture. He viewed Boogie Down Productions not as a musical group, but as a diversified firm with intellectual property assets. The investigation into his intellectual property strategy shows that his stubborn, uncompromising insistence on independence, his absolute refusal to be bought and sold by the predatory street label system, provided the original blueprint for the indie revolution that would eventually dismantle the major label monopoly, 30 years later. As we look at the landscape of the music industry today, we see the Scott LaRock method in every successful power move. When a modern artist refuses a traditional 360-degree deal in favor of distribution, they are following the ghost of Scott LaRock. When global superstars like Taylor Swift go through the arduous process of re-recording their entire catalogs to reclaim their master recordings, they are finishing the war that Scott Sterling started in a Bronx social work office in 1986. The investigation into intellectual property literacy shows that Scott was the first martyr for the cause of ownership over fame. He realized that if you don't own the physical recording, you don't own your history, you are simply a tenant in your own house. His death was more than a tragedy. It was a decades-long delay in the economic professionalization of black art. The investigation reveals a chilling forensic reality. Had Scott LaRock lived to see the 1,990 seconds, the golden age would have become the owner's age much sooner. He possessed the rare ability to bridge the gap between the street corners of Highbridge and the skyscrapers of Midtown. He was a man who could talk to a stick-up kid and a corporate lawyer in the same hour without ever changing his tone or losing his integrity. Instead of a mogul-led industry in the early 90 seconds, the culture spent the next 20 years trapped in a cycle of self-destruction and exploitative contracts, exactly as Scott had predicted. He was the prophet who saw the promised land of financial sovereignty, but was silenced at the very moment he reached for the keys to the gate. But as we close this chapter, we see the ultimate forensic victory of the blueprint. The investigation of modern business curriculum in elite music programs now includes the BDP story as a fundamental case study in contractual literacy and risk management. Scott LaRock finally became the teacher he always intended to be, though he had to die to prove his points. His degree from Castleton State wasn't just a piece of paper on a wall. It was a tactical weapon that the industry finally learned how to wield. He proved that the most street thing an artist can do is understand the fine print. As we move into the final chapter of this dossier, we will reach the final frequency. We will investigate the permanent resonance of the gentleman DJ and deliver the final verdict on the man whose silence remains the loudest, most expensive sound in the history of the Bronx. When Scott Sterling was lowered into the earth in 1987, the Bronx buried a body, but the world inherited a standard. As we conclude this forensic investigation into the life and death of Scott LaRock, we must look past the jagged tragedy of the Jeep Wrangler and the cooling blood on the pavement of Highbridge. We must look at the final frequency, the sonic and moral residue that remains when the gunfire and the static of the streets have finally vanished. The investigation reveals that Scott LaRock wasn't just the first high-profile casualty of the genre. He was the first architect to achieve immortality through the sheer, unshakable strength of his structural design. The legacy of the gentleman DJ is not found in the awards he never lived to hold, but in the forensics of integrity. The investigation shows that in the 4 decades since his murder, Scott's influence has acted as a silent, internal compass for every subsequent generation of hip-hop. When we analyze the birth of the Stop the Violence movement, we are looking at the exact moment a marginalized culture decided to stop reacting to its environment and start taking responsibility for its own survival. Scott's death forced hip-hop to grow up in a single, traumatic night. He was the price the culture had to pay to realize its own mortality and, paradoxically, its own potential for institutional power. But the most profound discovery in this dossier is the unbroken bloodline. Despite 25 years of radioactive silence between survivors, despite the survivor's debt of D-Nice and the son's burden carried by Scott Jr., the truth finally navigated its way home. The 2017 renaming of Scott LaRock Boulevard in the Bronx serves as the ultimate forensic validation. It is a permanent, steel and concrete testament to the fact that the system failed to delete the social worker. The city that once ignored the desperate cries of the Franklin Men's Shelter now has no choice but to look up at the name of the man who died trying to save the souls trapped inside it. The final verdict on the case of Scott LaRock is a lesson in defiant intellectualism. He proved with clinical precision that you could come from the roughest cradle of the Bronx and still possess the strategic mind of a CEO. He proved that kindness is not a weakness in a war zone, and that being smart is the most revolutionary act a young black man can perform. He was the first to realize that hip-hop could be a bridge between a desperate struggle and a sustainable solution. The investigation shows that while his physical life ended at 25, his frequency is still being broadcast through every independent label, every reclaimed master, and every artist who chooses to educate their audience rather than exploit them. As we turn off the lights on this dossier, the final image is not the cold darkness of the 27th of August 1987. It is the image of a young DJ in the Bronx today, putting on a pair of headphones and dropping the needle on the original pressing of South Bronx. He hears the crispness of the beat, the clarity of the vision, and the calm, unwavering power of a man who knew his worth decades before the world was ready to pay it. In that precise moment, the final frequency completes its loop. Scott LaRock is no longer a ghost. He is the foundation upon which the entire house is built. The case of Scott LaRock and the birth of hip-hop tragedy is officially closed. But the blueprint remains eternal. As long as the music is loud, Scott is still in the room.